So what we're going to look at today is the alignment of a subwoofer, which we have on the ground here, and a high mid speaker, which I'll just refer to as a high frequency speaker just along the way. Just in general, when this stuff is being aligned, you don't want to get your reference mic too far away from it. It's quite difficult to discern low frequencies on smart and on the scopes and stuff if it gets too far away. So the general rule of thumb that I use is that if the speaker was 2 meters, then the microphone would be 6 meters. So 3 times the height of the speaker is usually as far as you want to get away. So in this, we're going to talk about phase and time and the problems, the inherent problems of phase and time when you line this stuff up. We're going to place a high pass filter on the high frequency speaker and a low pass filter on the low frequency speaker, subwoofer, but that's not quite enough in most circumstances, as we will show here. So when we get this all aligned, we'll be looking at a frequency response. So this is a 90 hertz, and this is the emission of 90 hertz from these 2 speakers. So because that's the crossover frequencies, both speakers are doing 90 hertz together, and this is a nice clean summation of those 2 frequencies. So there's no disturbance in there. It's quite even. And it's also creating a great thing where we've sort of got a little bit of beaming. So it's kind of reducing the low frequencies that are going straight up in the air, which is a good thing. When you get this timing wrong and things are not great, you can end up sending low frequencies straight up into the air and not really out the front. So we can look at that. All right, let me just move to something else. All right, I just want to cover a little bit about phase, just to get everybody on the same page about what we're talking about when we're talking about phase shifts and time and space and that kind of thing. So, all right, phase shift, time and space. Basically, whenever you have the same frequency coming from 2 different sources, and that's what we're talking about here with the crossover. We're talking about a crossover point where the high frequency speaker and the low frequency speaker are generating the same frequency. Then timing is a real issue, and a change in timing causes a change in phase. So simply, if we just look at this graphic here, and I'll just make it a bit bigger, you've got 360 degrees in a circle, and that's equivalent to what we talk about phase in audio. So right round at 6 o'clock, we have 180 degrees out of phase, and that's what the polarity button, the phase flip button does on your console. It's a complete reversal of the phase, therefore it's a complete cancellation. That actually doesn't need to involve time. It's a change in polarity. So when you hit that button on your console, it doesn't actually change any time, but it does certainly invert the phase. Therefore, any 2 signals that are the same, that are getting mixed together with one at 180 degrees out of phase, will cancel itself out. So we don't usually bother going past minus 100 dB on the calculations, because for all intents and purposes, 100 dB is nothing to us. But when we talk about time, and at any frequency, when you change the time difference between 2 speakers, you actually get a phase shift. So this wheel here, and why that keeps jumping, I'm not sure. This wheel here is just kind of showing you that as you get different amounts of time changing, and say time is changing, one speaker's moving further away from you than one that's sitting stationary, there'll be this change when those two frequencies the change in level of those two frequencies that you're hearing. So as it moves away, there's a point where if they're both exactly the same, it's 6 dB. They'll add together perfectly. You'll get 6 dB increase in SPL. As you move around the side here, you can get to a point when they're slightly out of phase, at 90 degrees. You've shifted at a certain amount of time, and the summation of those two signals are now only adding up to an extra 3 dB. You shift it a little bit more around to 120 here. It doesn't even add. You've got two sounds and they're coming to you at a slightly different time, and they add together exactly the same as one sound would. So there's no increase. And then it gets pretty extreme from here. It starts to reduce 6 dB, and in just 30 degrees, it goes from -6 to -100. So that's quite an extreme cancellation, but it's a lot narrower than where the addition phase is. And this section from 0 dB here all the way around is where the addition phase is. And that's that's the simplest way you can sort of put that. It makes it easier if we look at something. So let's look at something. So basically, I've got two speakers here, just as a graphic, both pumping out 200 hertz sine tone, both right next to each other. And you can imagine that we're actually going to put a reference microphone directly equidistant between them right here on the page. So if we add those together and they're both exactly the same, the result will be an increase in 6 dB. So if we look at this, which is just scale to 1, those signals are both of amplitude of 1. Now we've got an amplitude of 2. And if you double the voltage or double the pressure, it's 6 dB plus. So the two waves, not unsurprisingly, add together, and we get 106 dB out of those two speakers, both delivering 100 dB. So that's the first step. That's the basics. That's the perfect situation. If we now just shift one speaker forward in time and we leave the microphone where it was, this sound's going to be in front of the other one. So if we look at the waveform comparison, we can see that they're starting in different points. But because this is only 90 dB, 90 degrees, you get 3 dB of addition. So we're still getting addition of 3 dB. And so we get 103 dB. So it's not cancelling, it's still adding a bit. Not as much as we could get, but it's still adding. If we move this a bit further, and the times and distances are down the bottom, but that really doesn't make a difference. We just know that relates to a certain degrees in phase. So now we're at 120 degrees, and these 200 dB signals are now going to combine together as a 100 dB signal. So if there's a substantial shift in time, you can get a situation where instead of the 200 dB signals adding together and giving you 6 dB more, they're now adding together and getting no benefit from having two signals at all. You may as well turn one speaker off and you'd still get the same level at the reference mic. So that's where time, can sort of play tricks on you when you're combining signals. The last one we have here is 180 degrees out of phase. So in theory, in the perfect world, acoustic anechoic chamber with no reflections in the room, those two signals would completely cancel each other out. And just going back there, it's a complete inversion of that phase. So that's great. So we've gone through one side. If we move this forward, it would start to add to itself again until we got 360 degrees, and we'd be back to +6 again. Okay, now we can do the same thing just quickly. We can just delay a speaker. So we're doing the same thing. Instead of shifting it in space, we're just shifting it in time. So Here we've got the same two speakers, and we're going to delay this second speaker by 1.25 milliseconds, which equates to a phase shift of 90 degrees. And again, just by delaying the speaker, which is, exactly the same as moving it in space, we've got the same thing. So we look at that, 90 degrees, we're only getting 103 dB. Do the next one. We shift it by 120 degrees, and then we measure those two signals, one being delayed. So it equates to a shift of 120 degrees. So the addition will be 0. And again, this would be like you could turn off one speaker and it wouldn't change the level at the reference microphone at all. So you can see that this stuff really can make a difference if you're summing two things together and expecting to get some extra energy out of it by the two summation, 6 dB more energy, and you're getting nothing. You're getting no more energy. It's like it's being eaten up somewhere. So it's phase and time shift is a very sort of weird thing, but this is what we're going to talk about when we're talking about the crossover point and the problems that occur at those points. All right. The last one is if we just delayed it by 180 degrees, then we should get 0. In a perfect world, we would get 0. In a room with two speakers like that, you'd probably still hear something, but it'd be a lot lower. But this is the theoretical level, and that's cool. All right. So the phase shift can be created by either changing the time or changing the space, as in the speakers in the space, one closer to you, one further away or further apart, that create a difference between those two things. All right. All right. So what I've done in this Maya Sound map program or audio prediction program is I've exported the simulations out into Smart. By the way, I have a free measurement software that a guy's brought out only very recently that's fantastic, runs on Mac and PC. And I will give you the links to that. And yeah, you don't have to pay $700 for Smart or muck around with it, because this software does exactly the same thing. Not quite as many features, but it measures stuff and allows you to store stuff, and it's great. All right, so here we are. First of all, we're going to look at this situation here, and we'll first just look at the high frequency box or the mid-high box. What we're simulating here is a 12-inch and a horn cabinet. And we will look at its measurement in this space at this microphone. So on here, I have got it here. Okay, so this is the full frequency response. So this hasn't had a high pass filter or the crossover filter put in place yet. So we're just looking at the general frequency response of the speaker, which is not bad. It's reasonably flat, only varies 3 or 4 dB across the whole spectrum. The speaker on its own goes down to about, what's that, 55 hertz or something, if you measure it at the 6 dB down point. It's pretty good. What we're going to look at today is we're going to cross it over at 90 hertz, which is a pretty usual place for low frequency crossover points. Now, up here in this graph, we have the phase. So what's interesting about this and what happens with all loudspeakers is that the speaker can remain fairly close to 0 in phase to a certain point, and then you'll see the phase increases. And the way these phase graphs work is this is like a continuation. When it goes off the graph here, it picks up down the bottom. And as it continues up here, it kind of picks up down the bottom here. So this is a wrapped phase. And so as the phase goes up, so does the delay in time. So there's a point with all loudspeakers and low frequency speakers, all about 250 hertz, start to delay the signal that's going through it. They can stay fairly consistent in phase to a certain point, and then they really start to get out of time with themselves. So the sound went in where, 1K was at the same time as the 100 hertz. So imagine a kick drum where there's a clicky bit on the kick drum and the bottom end of the kick drum. The speaker, by nature, by the effect of a loudspeaker, actually delays the low frequency by the action of having to convert magnetism into physical movement and energy. So this is a problem that can't go away. Loudspeakers inherently are always going to do it. So when we come down here and we look at where the time problem is with this speaker, it's right where we're starting to want to put a crossover. So at, where's 90? I'll just find my cursor on 90. It's telling me that it's 63 degrees out of phase at that point. So 63 degrees of delay. So we could work that out. We could calculate what that time is, and we will do that. But there is a delay problem at that frequency, and it's always going to be there. There isn't a speaker that's been designed that doesn't have that problem. Okay, so that's this top graph is, a pretty tricky thing to understand. I can tell you that 63 or 60 degrees is about 2 milliseconds, but we need to look at the subwoofer to find out what its phase is, to find the difference between those two phases. So my next step is to show you the low frequency subwoofer's frequency response. So I'll just turn that one off for a second. So this is the frequency response down the bottom. Built into the subwoofer's already got a low pass filter in it. And it looks like it's at about 100 hertz. But we're going to shift the crossover point down to about 90, so a little bit less than that. So we want to have a look at that, the action of that low pass filter when we put it on. It's got a crazy phase map. What's important to us is the phase where the speaker is actually emitting sound. So from this point through to this point is really important to us. And as you can see, it's got that same shifting. This frequency is in front of this frequency. So as we go up this, climb this thing, the sound is getting more and more delayed the lower we go. So even within this subwoofer, we've got the same problem, that there's a different time to all our frequencies. 100 hertz, it's at this time, 50 hertz, it's at that time. All right, all good. So we'll just bring that up again. So, I mean, usually you may choose your crossover frequency for all sorts of reasons, but if we looked at the full frequency response of the subwoofer and the full frequency response of the high frequency speaker, we could say anywhere they're about the same is a good spot. And so giving the low frequency, the subwoofer as much work as we can, because that's what it's designed for, we're going to put a crossover point at 90 hertz. So right where that cursor is there, that's where we're going to put two filters, a high pass filter on the high frequency speaker and a low pass filter. So I'll just put those on top of this so we can see. It's essentially, I'll just go back to here. So there's our high pass filter for the high box and our low pass filter. So that's the filter that's being applied to these things. But when we look at that, and if we look at that here, we can see it. If I can find where it is. Okay, and this one must be it. Okay, so I've got these all laid on top of one another just for the simple, for this exercise to start with. There's the full range high frequency box, and here's with the applied filter. So it's been cut off. So those two, it's taken the response back down to being about -6 dB off the average level here, right at this point, and same with the low frequency. So if I'll just turn that and that off. So yeah, we've put a high pass filter on it. Low frequency, same thing. And what we're left with then is this, where we have, we can look at the average level through here. And if we have a look at that point, each box is 6 dB down on each other. Therefore, when they add together, combine together in the venue, we should get, if everything's correctly aligned, we should get 6 dB, and this will flatten here. And so we have just, it looks like it's going to have a big hole in it, but we're going to, you know, get things right, and they will add together, and we'll have a nice flat response across the crossover. Even a little bit of a bump is usually desirable at the crossover point. It just helps smooth out that transition. But we'll see what happens when we do that here. Okay, so here we are. Here's our starting point. We've got our low frequency response and our high frequency response, and we've got that. But if we look up here, you can see that this dark green trace is quite a bit away from this brown trace. And this is where the problem is. If we wanted to look at that without any time correction, this is what we would get. Okay, so you can see, because of this phase difference, that we're not getting really any addition. We're getting a little bit of addition, but we're pretty much, it's just following the track. So we've got a big hole right here, because that's essentially because this problem of the difference between this green point at 90 Hertz, let me just find 90 Hertz. I think I can put a marker on that. And that one, so the green and the brown trace are 260 degrees apart. So that's saying to me, in my brain quickly calculating, that's saying that you're only going to get about 2 dB addition out of that. So we want 6 dB because we don't want to lose power, essentially losing a big hole of power. We're putting hundreds of watts into these speakers, and they're cancelling each other out at the crossover point. So, so if we just quickly look at that again, we've got the crossover point. This should be a nice flat line across here, and we're not getting that at all. So there's problems. Okay, how do you fix it? Right, well, you either have to delay the subwoofer or delay the high frequency, because you can do either. You can move the subwoofer back in time and reconnect these points, or you can move the high frequency speaker back in time. And the way you choose is which is the shortest time to get back in phase or correct time. And if I've just looked at that and that's 260 degrees, then 360 degrees is 360. So 100 degrees is the difference one way, and 260 degrees is the difference the other way. So it's a crazy bit of mathematics, but there are things that I use to actually help that. I don't have to calculate it on the way. I just have spreadsheets. If we look down the bottom here, I can actually put those details in, and it gives me the time that I should delay. So what we're actually going to do now is we're going to delay this green line 100 degrees, so going down. So it goes down to the edge and picks up to the top and comes down to this point here. that, my little graph over here, I should do that accurately, but I'm pretty sure it's 3.3 degrees, 3.3 milliseconds, sorry. So I'm going to show you what those two lines once we've corrected that. So let me just click off a few things here. Okay, so just going back to here, what I've done with this next box is I've actually delayed this high frequency speaker 3.3 milliseconds, which, when I was talking before, is 100 degrees at 90 hertz. So over here, if we look at 90 now, here you can see in that area that both traces, both phase traces are right virtually on top of one another. I'm just going to add this little section into the video because there was a question about these traces here. So what we have is we have applied 3.3 milliseconds delay to the high frequency box to compensate for the phase difference between the two traces. Okay, the question was, why did the low frequency trace move down to the high frequency trace? Well, the answer to that is that once we delayed the high frequency trace, we recalibrated the delay on the measurement mic to compensate for the extra 3.3 milliseconds. So what that effectively has done has moved the subwoofer forward in time and left the high frequency speaker in the same place. The same phase relationship and the same place. So what this is displaying is that we have actually moved the subwoofer forward in time, and therefore we've moved the subwoofer's trace down to match up with the high frequency speaker's trace. So that's why that has happened. We haven't seen a change in the high frequencies trace because it's been recompensated. So it's telling us the phase, but what that is telling us that they are time aligned, so they are in line with each other. So now if we look at the full frequency response from the system, you'll see that it is looking a lot better. Okay, so it's not a great color, but anyway, now this is the combination of those two cabinets, and you can see we're now getting 6 dB addition from that crossover point. You will notice it kind of dips either side, and that's because there's a phase shift here a little bit, and there's a bit of a phase shift up here. So there's no perfect situation there, but what we've managed to do is actually time align that subwoofer and high frequency speaker. So we're actually getting all the energy that we're putting in, and the crossover point is summing in the room perfectly. So I'm going to show you that on this screen here. So first of all, I'm just going to show you what it looks like when we didn't do any time alignment. So that was these two frequencies not time aligned, so the phase was different. I should actually bring the other one up. Sorry. So that one, when there's 260 degrees one way and it's basically 100 degrees out of phase, and this is what we've done. So that's what that looks like. So you can see it's not very neat. There's a really big disturbance here. Not that there's any people up there, or there might be a balcony up there. You never know, whatever venue you're working in. But you're getting this crazy distribution of low frequencies out the front and straight out the top. So it's not something you really would predict when you think about it, but you do get a fairly messy distribution of low frequencies at the crossover if they're not time aligned. And if I go back to the time aligned one, you'll see that that's really neat and cool. So the hardest thing about doing this stuff is just reading the data that comes from SMART or whatever analysis software you use. But the trick is just to be quite systematic in what you do. First of all, you measure the full frequency response of the speaker to start with. So we'll just go back to that and the low frequency, and you determine a good point to put your crossover in. More often than not, 90 hertz is the one that sounds the best. You can go to 100. It depends, you know, whether you've got to share the load a bit. So if you've got a front of house high boxes that have 15-inch speakers in it, you can probably afford to have a lower crossover frequency. So they do their fair share of the low frequency stuff. If you had a high frequency boxes with 8-inch speakers in it, you might go to 120 as a crossover point. But for most things I see, it's usually around 90 hertz. And 90 hertz is a kind of a good figure. So the first step is to measure both boxes in full range. And then you determine your crossover frequency. From that step, you determine that you want to cross it over at a point, and you choose that point. This is where you need to make quite accurate measurements. So the first one can be quite general. You just want to see that the speaker gets to the crossover point quite strongly, and you know it's not going to already be rolling off before it gets to the crossover point. So we looked at that. There was plenty there for both speakers. This measurement, you measure the high frequency box and the low frequency box separately, and this is where you determine where the problems are. So this is not an extreme situation. I mean, any phase shift can occur depending on who makes the speaker and what size the speaker is. And even with low frequency boxes, whether they're ported or bandpass and front loaded or W bins, they'll all have a slightly different phase shift across those actions. So we need to accurately pinpoint the two phase points at the crossover. So in SMART, it's easy. You can just put the mouse and get approximately 90 hertz and you'll see a figure. And write that down and then look at the other figure up the top at it. And you basically take the shortest path. And what you just need to understand is that when you shift something in time, this will drop. So if we did delay the subwoofers, we would be delaying them back down to this point here. But because we're delaying the high frequency, we're delaying it back down and we jump across to the top and back to here. So that's the shortest path. So it's a little bit tricky. I use an Excel sheet that I can just punch in those numbers. I put in the crossover. I put in the crossover point. I put in the high frequency phase point, the low frequency phase point, and it tells me the two compensations I could make, and really you just pick the smallest one. And in general, it's better to always delay the main high frequency speakers or front of house speakers than the subwoofer. The subwoofer is already starting to go behind time by the nature of low frequencies being getting further and further behind as you drop in frequency. So that's what we do. So I have that little spreadsheet for that kind of stuff. And what you want to see when you've time aligned everything and you've time aligned it and you've measured the boxes individually is that you want to see them very close to one another. A couple of degrees here is not going to make any substantial difference. But it is really important when you're looking at two different speakers that is as close as possible to each other. You know, 10 or 20 degrees out of phase is not a problem. It's not a lot of loss of energy. But if you think that, you know, if you take a 100-watt amplifier and you had a switch on it that said turn it to 200 watts and you hit that switch, you would only get 3 dB more power out of that speaker. So power is a funny thing. If you want to, if you don't get this right and you don't get summation of 6 dB and you're only getting summation of 0 dB, you're essentially cutting your power of your amplification at that point by a quarter. So, you know, if you're losing 6 dB from part of your system, you're essentially turning that part of the system down by a quarter. So that's quite a substantial loss of power, going from 1,000 watts to 250 watts at one point. So in big systems, they're really particular about this. They want it to be full. They want it to be nice and rich across the crossover point. It helps kind of blur that point at the crossover point where some sounds may go down to the subwoofer and back up through that point, like a moving, shifting melody that uses low frequencies. You want that to be really strong. So when we time align here, we correct the phase, and essentially that equates to a time. So phase in relation to a frequency gives you a time. And that's what we've been looking at today. We've been looking at correcting that problem. These are two simulated real speakers in real life. So if I set that system up somewhere, I would have to do this exact process. And theoretically, I'd get the same phase shift and I would apply the same delay to that top speaker. So again, I'll just put the total full frequency response now. So we're measuring the whole system as it is, and we're getting a nice, relatively even across the crossover frequency. And that is aligning subwoofers using dual FFT Smart, or SIM is one, the Maya Sound one. And there's a new free one that is fantastic, and I'll give you, Robin, the links to that. It's called Open Sound Meter. It's a bit different looking, but anyway. So there we have it.
That, will that change in different rooms?
Not usually.
Mm-hmm.
It's once you've kind of set that crossover and your boxes are sitting in the same relative position to your listeners, like that would be a flat floor, and it'd have to be a pretty steep, you know, raked seating for that to be a problem. But once you've determined that time, it will stay the same. It's worth doing it. Like a lot of testing of your own speakers, it's always worth doing it in a open field, because you can get those settings. You know, you can hear what your speakers sound like when they're outside a room, when there's no room involved, and you can align. It's a lot easier to align a subwoofer outdoors than it is to align one indoors, because of the reflective nature of the roof and the floor, and it messes up your data a fair bit.
Yeah.
Okay.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Okay.